Welcome to the America's 360 podcast. Get the inside scoop and the outside perspective on the latest developments from Canada, Latin America, and everywhere in between. America's 360 is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of America's 360. I'm John Molesky. This program is brought to you by the world's #1 think tank for regional studies. And America's 360 is a collaboration among the Wilson Center's Argentina Project, Brazil Institute, Canada Institute, Latin American Program, and Mexico Institute. Well, as the region struggles to secure and distribute COVID-19 vaccines, several countries in the Americas are also scrambling to organize safe and fair elections. Today, our Wilson Center experts will discuss how governments are preparing for this year's super cycle of elections and how the diverse responses to the pandemic are shaping voters' preferences across the region. First up, we turn our attention to the political repercussions faced by President Bolsonaro in Brazil stemming from his handling of the pandemic. Later, our panelists will provide thoughts on recently held elections in Ecuador and Peru and also forthcoming elections across the region, why these are so crucial to the hemisphere and beyond. But first, let's welcome back our regulars. Please say hello to Argentina Project Director Benjamin Gaden.
Hi there, John.
Hi, Benjamin. Latin American Program Director Cindy Arnson.
Hey, John.
Hi, Cindy. Mexico Institute Director Andrew Rudman.
Hi, John.
Hi, Andrew. Welcome back.
And Canada Institute Director Christopher Sands.
Hello, bonjour, John.
Thanks, Chris. Hi to you, too. That was Chris speaking Canadian, for those of you who need translation. And the Slater Family Fellow and Senior Associate for the Brazil Institute, Anya Prusa. Hi, Anya.
Hi, John.
Hello, Anya. And I want to begin with you, Anya, if I could. In my script said Bolsonaro's handling of the pandemic, and my brain was screaming mishandling. What is happening in Brazil, and how did it get to this crisis point?
Yeah, so the situation with the pandemic in Brazil is incredibly serious. There's been over 350,000 fatalities due to COVID-19. The average daily death toll at the moment is about 3,000, and it has at certain points in recent weeks hit 4,000 deaths a day. And these are, the highest numbers in the world right now. Doctors Without Borders actually called it a humanitarian crisis. And I can tell you, John, from my conversations with colleagues and with family members in Brazil, that people are incredibly worried. And many of them feel that their government and President Jair Bolsonaro has not done enough to control the COVID-19 pandemic, has not based the government's response on scientific evidence and recommendations. And in fact, we've seen that Bolsonaro's approval rating has gone down in recent months. His approval rating right now is about 30%, which is the lowest in his presidency. And at the same time, he is facing significant political pressures. So former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva recently had his corruption convictions overturned. And so Lula is now eligible to run for re-election in 2022. If the election were held tomorrow, polls show that Lula would win. And so that's definitely going to be on Bolsonaro's mind, even though we have a year and a half between now and the actual election. The other source of real political pressure is actually coming from Bolsonaro's allies in Congress. So he has an alliance with the Centrão, or the Big Center, which is a group of rent-seeking political parties that tend to align with whoever the government of the day is. However, this political alliance is a bit tenuous at the moment. Congress has not been happy with the way that Bolsonaro has handled the pandemic. And in fact, we saw at the end of March that the Speaker of the House, Arthur Lira, gave a pretty clear warning to Bolsonaro. He said he was putting out the yellow flag, in a soccer reference, and warned the president that Congress has certain political remedies at its disposal if the government did not get a handle on the pandemic.
What is that? That a thinly veiled threat of impeachment?
Yes. And not that veiled either. I think everyone understood what he was saying. Bolsonaro certainly understood it. I mean, less than a week later, we saw him do a major cabinet reshuffle in an effort to, shore up support in key cabinet positions. And he also brought in a member of Congress, one of Arthur Lira's allies, to serve as his cabinet secretary in charge of that relationship with Congress.
Another president in the hemisphere, a populist president by the name of Donald Trump, never recovered from his handling of the pandemic. If you look at exit polls on why Joe Biden won the presidency, we'll go back to Brazil in a minute, Anya, but first I want to ask Benjamin and some of the others about the regional reaction and why other countries are concerned. We talk about distinct countries as if borders exist in nature. And the reality is the virus doesn't know whether it's in Brazil, Argentina, or wherever it might be. Benjamin, how is the region reacting?
Yeah, with great concern, John. I mean, Anya's focusing understandably on the domestic politics of the mishandling of the pandemic in Brazil. That's of less interest to countries like neighboring Uruguay, which are thinking about why this far into the pandemic, they're facing the highest daily caseloads they've seen. And the reason is this so-called P1 variant that, emerged from Brazil and is now spreading throughout South America, which is now the global epicenter of COVID-19. This is of concern to the United States as well. I mean, there's always this fear that some variants could emerge given the scale of spread in a country the size of Brazil that would render ineffective or less effective some of the vaccines that have been developed. So really everyone in the world, and particularly Brazil's South American neighbors, have a stake in Brazil getting this virus back under control.
Cindy, is Bolsonaro the skunk at this garden party, or does he have company? Are there others in the region who have mishandled the pandemic?
Well, no country really has gotten a good handle on the pandemic. Brazil, I think, stands out, as does Mexico, in terms of a lack of leadership in dealing with the population, dealing with health measures to stem the spread of the pandemic, and certainly in terms of vaccine rollout. But Bolsonaro, I think, really is a standout case. But that said, even the countries that did well initially, such as Peru, or seemed to have a leg up on vaccination, such as Chile, which was in the top 5 globally in terms of the percentage of its population that had been vaccinated. Even Chile is facing these huge new outbreaks, and some of it is the new strain from Brazil. It's also the end of the South American summer when people were traveling. There's pandemic fatigue all over the region. People are just sick of these severe lockdowns. But I would say Brazil, followed by Mexico, stand out as countries that have really botched the leadership issue.
Andrew, you want to weigh in on Mexico's role in botching the pandemic?
Sure. Well, I think it occurs to me what Cindy just said is absolutely right, and maybe it's a question of some countries attempted to address it, and while they haven't been perfectly successful, they made an effort, and there are things that can be pointed to. And then you look at Brazil and Mexico, where the leadership initially seemed to want to disavow the existence of the pandemic. And so maybe at the end of the day, nobody has done it well, but maybe you get brownie points for at least having acknowledged it was a problem and tried to fix it as opposed to trying to wish it away.
Yeah. Chris, you've made the point in previous discussions on the pandemic that Canada and other richer nations have a role here in providing assistance. But Canada itself does not have a robust percentage of the population vaccinated.
Yes, I think in this sense, although Canada is wealthy, it has a very limited capacity to make vaccines. And this is an interesting challenge for them. Over a number of years, Canada, with a public health system, has tried to favor generic manufacturers to help reduce the cost, domestic generic manufacturers to help reduce the cost of major medicines. And while that makes sense at one level, it's led to less investment from international pharmaceutical giants like Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, and others. So at the same time, other parts of the Western world have really been part of discovering vaccines and getting them out to people. Canada's found itself trying to buy those vaccines on the global market. And that's not really their fault, but it is something that's made Trudeau's life much harder and frustrated Canadians who would like to see their vaccination rates closer to the US or even the UK.
Anya, so you've heard your colleagues describe a circumstance where there's not necessarily, the cavalry isn't necessarily coming to Brazil's aid. Where can it turn for assistance?
Brazil's definitely in a hard spot. We have seen over the last month that Bolsonaro has become more interested in looking for help. So he applied for Brazil to receive vaccines through the COVAX facility. He entered into deals with Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson to secure more doses for Brazil. But because Brazil waited so long to do a lot of these agreements, it is going to take months before they start seeing significant numbers of vaccine doses arriving within the country. Brazil has some domestic manufacturing. The Butantan Institute and Fiocruz as well are two really highly regarded medical institutes with a long track record of producing vaccines. But the challenge is getting a lot of the inputs, the reactive elements of the vaccine that you need, and those are being imported from abroad, from China, from India, and those are countries that need them for their own vaccine production. So Brazil is really between a rock and a hard place when it comes to getting more vaccine doses right now, and Brazil needs doses right now to control a pandemic that really is continuing to get worse.
We have a general agreement here that the virus isn't going to limit itself to any nation's borders. So Benjamin, where is the cavalry? Should other countries be paying intense attention to the crisis in Brazil so that this doesn't spiral out of control?
They should, and particularly the United States. I think it's easy to sit back and blame Brazil for its own problems, and it has, from the very beginning, mismanaged this public health crisis. But the reality is this impacts the United States. There's moral arguments, there's public health arguments, there's economic arguments. And if you look at the numbers of doses, the entire Latin America has administered less than 80 million doses. The United States alone, it's about 212 million. So the disparity hurts the U.S. image, hurts the U.S. interests. And I think, sooner rather than later, the United States really should be the cavalry coming to the rescue. Again, whether or not Brazil's responsible for this problem or not.
All of you have either spoken or written or both about the politics of the pandemic and how China and Russia are using this to potentially get a leg up on the U.S. in some regions of the country. What about those foreign influences, or at least foreign aid, potential sources of foreign aid? What about those in Brazil, Anya?
Well, what's really interesting is that Brazil, through the state of Sao Paulo, had partnered with a Chinese company, Sinovac, to produce Coronavac, right, which is actually being domestically produced in Brazil. But at the same time that this collaboration was happening at the state level, we were seeing tensions between the federal government and China. President Bolsonaro has been highly skeptical of Chinese influence within Brazil, despite the fact that China is Brazil's largest trade partner. And so this has complicated, I think, as well, Chinese support for Brazil in this moment.
I want to get all of your thoughts as we wrap up this first segment on, is this a sea change for Brazilian politics? Are the struggles of Bolsonaro going to create trend lines versus headlines? And Anya, I'm going to save you the last word on this and get some thoughts from your colleagues first. Let's start in the far north with Christopher Sands. Do you detect that we are looking at trend lines here, Chris, or headlines?
Well, I think it all depends on the lessons learned that we take from this. We've sort of gone into a giant social experiment around the world as we've tried to respond to really unprecedented events, not just a pandemic, but a shutdown of our normal economy and a public health effort that really has reached deep into the lives of ordinary people around the world. Just as the pandemic, COVID-19, has hit hard people whose pre-existing conditions left them vulnerable to the pandemic, countries that had problems going into this, whether it was development deficits or problems of corruption or problems of lack of infrastructure, all paid a much heavier price. So as we move out of this pandemic, I think the key is to see what lessons we can draw from it so that it never happens again, or at least never happens again like this. We have to be more prepared next time.
Andrew, your thoughts, and this notion that we can be collectively better prepared, that there can be more integration of approach among countries. Are you hopeful in that regard?
I'm definitely hopeful. I think, as Chris was saying, I think it's necessary that we learn from the past. We've tried that in North America. We tried after the 2009 H1N1 flu pandemic, and there were a lot was written, a lot of ideas about what should be done and how we should prepare. And if you read those reports now, you see that, yes, some was done, but a lot of it was ignored. So I think we definitely have to learn we have to learn from that experience. I'd also point out a really interesting study that the University of California, San Francisco's Institute for Global Health Sciences just released, actually one on Mexico and one on the US, looking at the pandemic response at the behest of the WHO. Really two fascinating reports. And I was reminded of this by one of Chris's comments, because the Mexico report in particular points out the deficiencies and the disruptions in the healthcare system, particularly when López Obrador tried to revise the healthcare system. That exacerbated the response. So I think it goes back to a point I've made many times, which is that you have to fund your healthcare system before there's a problem and not after.
Benjamin, your thoughts?
I think the argument that Latin America has weak institutions, has really gained a lot of unfortunate evidence right now. And particularly the cases that we've talked about, Mexico and Brazil, you have leaders who have shown disdain for these institutions, who've wanted to concentrate power, and they have managed the pandemic worse than practically all other governments. So I think it is a message to voters as well of the dangers of electing people who feel like they embody the state, and the state doesn't need any competing sources of power or administrative capabilities.
Cindy, your thoughts, and we'll try to limit it to Brazil in this segment, because when we come back, we'll talk about how these trend lines might be affecting other countries' politics.
Sure. Well, I think that what's happening is the pandemic is deepening this sense among the public in Latin America, in Brazil, but in many other countries, that government officials just are incapable of addressing the concerns that affect people's daily lives. And I think that, to the extent that there's been a lot of talk about a crisis of representation and all that kind of thing, which we'll talk about in a moment when we talk about Peru in particular, the disaffection, of publics with their leaders, elected or not, their alienation from the political system, I think is going to be a long-term effect of this. And in terms of whether Brazil represents a headline or a trend line, I mean, I do think that while there are common denominators that all the countries are facing this sharp economic decline, public health crisis, the way each country responds really depends on their own politics. And, there's a lot of talk about going into next year's election in Brazil of a showdown between former President Lula and current President Bolsonaro that will again be a very polarized political debate. So, that's not a trend line so much. I mean, I think that's very unique to Brazil, but nonetheless shows the kind of ideological cleavages that continue to exist in the region.
Thanks, Cindy. Anya, when we first met at Ye Olde Wilson Center, the topic when we discussed Brazil was about the BRICS and all of the economic potential. It seems like an alternate universe now. What do you see as far as the future of Brazilian politics as a result of what's occurred?
Brazil really sits at a crossroad, more than any moment, I think, in recent years, where, there are different choices. As Cindy was saying, Brazilian voters feel incredibly disaffected. They do not feel that their government represents them or is taking the steps needed to protect them. And that's not just the pandemic, but also the economic crisis that you mentioned, John. The real question is, a year and a half from now, is this going to be a race between, Lula and Bolsonaro, who both represent in some ways the past? Or are Brazilians going to come up with an alternate, right? A candidate who is looking towards the future, who can unite some of these different parts of Brazilian society? And I think we don't have a clear answer on that yet. But I will say that I have been encouraged. The silver lining, right, has been the incredible innovation that we're seeing within civil society and within the private sector right now in responding to the pandemic and responding to the needs of the moment. There's been incredible collaboration between, in the healthcare space, for example, between private hospitals and public hospitals, trying to make sure that the system continues to function. And a lot of people care really deeply and are working really hard to push Brazil forward. And so for me, I think that's where we're going to see the change really come from.
Well, you did what I thought might be impossible a few minutes ago, is ended on a bit of an up note. So thank you for that. Thanks to all of you. We'll be right back. Stick around, everyone. When we return, our roundtable will turn its focus to recent and upcoming elections. You're listening to America's 360. Hello and welcome back. I'm John Molesky, and this is America's 360. Our roundtable will now turn its sight to elections, and plenty of them, some that have just happened and some that are coming your way. Recent elections held in Ecuador and Peru, and in one circumstance, we have a winner, and another, we are headed toward a runoff. I'm going to ask Cindy Arnson to start our discussion by telling us about those elections. Cindy.
Sure. John, as you mentioned, on April 11th, Ecuador held the second round of its presidential election, and Peru held the first round. And the results in both cases really kind of upended the expectations and the predictions of pollsters. There was a sense in Ecuador that a protege of former populist President Rafael Correa would win. He had won the first round by about 12 points, having a lead of over 12 points over Guillermo Lasso, who was elected president. And yet Lasso triumphed, and with a fairly comfortable margin, something like 52% to 47%. And I think it was the indigenous movement and the candidate that very, very closely came in second for that second slot in the runoff, Yaku Perez. I think a lot of Perez's supporters went over to Lasso and put the indigenous movement in a different kind of position than it has been. They also have a large block of in the Congress. And Lasso will have a lot of trouble, I think, governing. The markets, of course, were very happy. He is a member of the private sector, a former banker, has pledged to live by the terms of the IMF agreement that was signed by the last government in Ecuador. But we'll have to raise taxes. One of the easiest things that people do, rather than making wealthy people pay higher taxes, is increase what's called the VAT tax, which is essentially a sales tax, extremely regressive. That is likely to be very unpopular. And, at some point, Ecuador, like Peru, suffered tremendously in terms of the percentage of deaths as a percentage of total cases. Both economies heavily dependent on commodity exports, again, slammed by the pandemic with really larger than the median decline in the economy. Peru, I think, was even more of a surprise. The person that came in first, Pedro Castillo, a left-wing teacher, was not even sort of listed. His name didn't even appear in the polls that had the top, 5 or 6 candidates, going into this first round. And Keiko Fujimori, who has been around for a long time, the daughter of the former president, Alberto Fujimori, condemned to a long prison sentence because of human rights violations and corruption during his government. She's back. She came in second place. But what's probably the most striking takeaway from the Peru election is that the number of blank and null votes that were cast exceeds the number of votes that were cast for the front runner and therefore the second runner. And another sort of key takeaway is that if you combine the votes of number 1 and number 2 of Castillo and Keiko Fujimori, you don't get more than a third of the Peruvian electorate, which means that 2/3 of the Peruvian electorate doesn't want either of them. So it's really a big question mark. What is going to happen going into June 6th? I think a lot of people are appalled to have a choice between what many see as equal poisons. So we'll have to see what happens over these next weeks.
It's not unusual in elections to vote against someone, but what you describe is that idea on steroids. Castillo 19%, Fujimori 13%, 18 candidates were available for the initial choice. Benjamin, about that, maybe before we dig deeper into some of the elections, if you could just talk about that. The Wilson Center is U.S. based, and a big chunk of our audience tends to be in the United States. Certainly, some of our focused audiences, like the U.S. Congress, when you look at American politics, winning 50 or 51% often is still a difficult formula for governing. Here we're talking about the frontrunners with 19 and 13% and 18 on the ballot. Give our U.S. viewers some perspective on how different that type of equation is.
Well, John, I mean, they have a system in these countries, which we don't have in the United States, which is multiple rounds in the election. And the idea of that is supposed to allow voters to coalesce around a candidate. The winning candidate eventually will have a majority of the electorate and theoretically could moderate their agenda and their platform in order to achieve, a broader coalition. So that's sort of the good story of what could occur. The reality is anytime you have an election where you're choosing between el mal menor, the lesser of two evils, it's not a great way to inspire the electorate, particularly if you have a divided Congress as you'll have in these cases. And so, you have a real crisis of representation that Cindy referenced earlier in our conversation, and you will not solve that and strengthen democracies if people are so appalled by their options that the top, voted candidate is the null ballot, either abstaining even though voting is obligatory or simply spoiling your ballot. So, I think in the U.S. context, you're right, John. We have a lot of polarization, and we're seeing that in Latin America, despite, again, the multiple stages in the elections that are supposed to solve that.
Cindy, when will round two take place?
Round two takes place on June 6th. So it's less than 2 months away, and there will be a lot of flux. But one thing that is also notable is that Castillo's election base was mostly in the highlands. I mean, Peru for centuries, has had this divide, as has Ecuador, between the highlands and the coastal areas. And Keiko probably has a plurality in Lima, the capital city, and Castillo's support is in these rural areas, and that's why he did not register in the polls, because that sort of kind of opinion is not captured, when people are making phone calls to a landline to gauge voter intention.
Well, it certainly makes great soap opera, a virtually unknown teacher versus the heiress to the dynasty. So let's turn our attention to Mexico. Andrew Rudman.
Sure. The midterm elections are also on June 6th, and Mexico will elect over 21,000 offices on that day. It's the biggest election that Mexico has ever had, 15 governorships, the entire lower house of the Congress, and lots of other positions. The current president, AMLO, and his party are hoping to get a supermajority. They have a majority in the lower house, but hope to have a 2/3 majority. Depending on who you ask, that either is or isn't likely to happen. Prevailing wisdom at the moment seems to be that they won't quite get the 2/3. But I think there are a number of really interesting issues that we're looking at around that election. One is the role of women and how they will vote and how certain candidates will fare. Another is the independence of institutions. The president and his party have attacked the National Elections Institute, have suggested that it is not impartial, and have even some candidates have threatened violence against the INE. So that's obviously of great concern. And then the last point that we're looking at has to do with how Mexico may respond in terms of its international commitments, particularly the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Some of the measures that AMLO would like to push forward, if he has a supermajority, would likely go in contrast to the USMCA terms.
Is it along the lines of what we've been discussing? Will this election turn on reaction to handling of the pandemic? How dominant will that issue be?
Not as dominant as you might guess, given the way Mexico has handled the pandemic. I mean, one interesting statistic I saw recently is that, as you might guess, AMLO's popularity is greater among people who have been vaccinated. So there's a huge push to vaccinate as many people as possible. The whole vaccination campaign has been politicized in Mexico in unhelpful ways. But probably not as dominant as you might guess.
So it's not a chicken in every pot, it's a hypodermic needle in every arm, is the promise here. Chris, turning to Canada, I guess we're talking about potential elections. Tell us what's happening in Canada.
Well, sure, John. So normally, you have an election in Canada in the fourth year of a 5-year mandate. They switched to fixed elections a couple of years ago. And so we have a fairly predictable scene. However, the current government of Justin Trudeau is a minority government, and the typical duration of a minority government in Canada is about 24 months. So as we're just crossing into month 18, everyone's been expecting that Trudeau might call an election as a way to increase his majority and have a freer hand in managing the pandemic, among other things. We had a budget on Monday, April 19, that was a perfect pre-election budget. Lots of spending for lots of different priorities, but not any big increase in taxes. And while in general that's a good signal before an election, makes the voters very happy, there's a lot of concern in Canada that the money's maybe not going into the best investments. And so the opposition has a chance to say, we're going to try to bring the government down on a budget vote. Now, I think that's a very long shot, maybe 10% chance. But the advantage of doing that for the opposition parties is they could then have first crack at forming a government without an election. The Conservatives have 120 seats. They could govern in an even weaker minority, but have the ability to rack up some points and send Trudeau into the opposition benches. That's probably the excitement, as high as the excitement ever gets in Canada for politics. We think the election may be in June. It could be delayed until August or September if the government just doesn't feel its poll numbers are great. But the first step is to see how the budget is voted on by the Parliament. I'll just add one thing in light of some of my colleagues' comments, though. We've had 2 recent elections in Canada that show very similar trends to what we're seeing elsewhere. The first one in Newfoundland took place on March 25th. And because of a COVID surge right before the vote, the government canceled all in-person voting, delayed the election by 2 weeks, and shifted entirely to mail-in ballots. Now, Newfoundland's a small place with a small population, but that sudden change brought a change in government and a very narrowly divided parliament. Proposed with that kind of challenge, people split right down the middle, something we're seeing elsewhere, with not a strong governing majority. Similarly, on April 12th, just last week, the Yukon Territory had an election. It too divided exactly evenly, with one jurisdiction up in the northern part of the Yukon Territory voting 78 votes to 78 votes, dead tie. And they had a judicial recount, which was mandated, which found it was still tied. And so what ended up happening was they drew straws. And it turned out that the NDP, the New Democratic Party candidate, won the election. But that parliament is so tightly divided that the Yukon is going to have to be governed by consensus going forward. So minority governments or dead ties, this seems to be part of the new politics of COVID in Canada, at least.
Thanks, Chris. We're short on time, but before we close, we're going to run over a little bit. I'd like to know just anyone who'd like to throw any other thoughts into the mix about what we've been talking about, other elections we haven't mentioned or teed up that might be coming the way that you're going to be keeping an eye on, maybe some of the broader trends. I know, Benjamin, I'll pull back the curtain for people who are listening. And in our chat function, Benjamin mentioned that there's some good news here and that elections are taking place in the midst of a pandemic. So any things that you'd like to add to the discussion before we close things out?
I mean, I just said, John, they're not just taking place, but they're generally free and fair. You have, the opposition in October in Bolivia won an election, and there was, no protests, no violence. You've had 2 elections in Ecuador, 1 in Peru. And, in Ecuador, you had the, affiliates of a former populist, somewhat authoritarian movement accept the results right away. And again, no questioning the quality of the vote. This is despite, the pandemic conditions that make it very tough to hold elections. They don't have the options that Chris was describing to do voting by mail. And yet people are showing up and the systems are working.
I might take a little bit exception to that, Benjamin, because I think, for a long time, people in Latin American studies have pushed back against the notion that democracy is equivalent to the holding of elections. And I agree with you that, people's willingness to brave the pandemic and stand in line for a long period of time is really commendable in the face of the dangers, the actual physical dangers that they face. But just holding an election that is reasonably free and fair, and having the opponent or the losing party recognize the fairness of the election or the outcome of the election, to me, just really begs the question of, the content of democracy, the quality of democracy, this whole issue of whether people feel represented by their systems. And I think most of the indicators on that front are fairly pessimistic.
Cindy, I think you've teed up a terrific future topic for us about how we measure the health of democracies beyond a ballot box. Good stuff. Any other quick final thoughts before we close things out? Okay, everyone has had their say. What have we fixed? Have we solved any problems? I know we talk about things, but we're not here to act on them. But if elected, thanks everyone. Cindy, Anya, Benjamin, Chris, Andrew, thank you very much for your insights. Always valuable, and we look forward to learning more from you in future episodes. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center at America's 360, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
You have been listening to America's 360, a podcast about the innumerable ties among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. You can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. To learn more about our programs, please visit wilsoncenter.org. And please join us again next time for another episode of America's 360.